Welcome back to the Politics and Media programme, where we're continuing our discussion about how politicians should engage with black and ethnic minority communities. My new guests in the studio are Alok Sharma, Conservative MP for Reading West and Vice Chairman of BME Communities, Murad Qureshi, Labour London Assembly Member, and Dr Richard Hayton, Lecturer in Politics at the University of Leeds. Dr Hayton is also the author of a recent book on Conservative Party leadership and strategy. On the phone, we're joined by Nigel Farage, MEP, leader of UKIP. Welcome to the programme, everybody. So, Alok, this drive by Cameron to recruit more black and Asian MPs, do you think it's going to be able to push the standing of the Tory party up from something like only 16% support it has amongst those communities at the moment?
Well, I think what's very interesting, if you look at the ethnic minority British election survey that took place after the 2010 election, carried out by the Runnymede Trust, one of the key findings of it was that actually when it comes to values, the values of all ethnic minority communities are much more aligned with the Conservative Party than any of the other political parties. And I think what's important for us is to demonstrate through our policies and through our engagement that actually these shared values are also translated into the policies that we have got on the ground. And I think that is the way that you engage, that's the way that you communicate, and that is the way that you build trust over a longer period of time.
Let me bring in Nigel Farage, who's joining us on the phone. I mean, Nigel, all right, lots of commentators kind of see UKIP as the kind of traditional Tory party in exile. Do you think this is a response by Cameron to try and bolster up support in other areas?
Well, of course it is. And I mean, generally, the Conservative Party is having a very bad time with its traditional base. I don't blame him for trying to reach out to different communities, but I do think that there's one thing that he's missing here, and that is that there's this whole dimension with the black and Asian communities in Britain, that so many of them come from countries that are part of the Commonwealth. And, of course, what we've done as a nation, we've done it for 40 years, I know, but we've rather turned our backs on the Commonwealth in favour of Europe, which to begin with was a common market and looked like quite a good idea, and my mum and dad voted for it, but has now become a political union whereby we have an open-door immigration policy and work policy to anybody from Poland and from next year to Bulgaria and Romania, and yet it's actually quite difficult for successful, reputable courier houses to bring chefs in from the subcontinent. And I think the one thing that UKIP perhaps has to offer on this is that we are a very strong pro-Commonwealth party.
Richard, just getting back to the core of this issue, do you think that the Tory party actually does have the capability of rebuilding or strengthening a base in these communities with this kind of tactic?
Well, the evidence is that the Conservatives have actually made some progress with voters from black and ethnic minority communities. However, they're building from a very low base. So at the 2010 election, it was only around 16% of BME voters actually voted for the Conservative Party, which was a record high, up from about 12%. So the Cameron's strategy does seem to indicate that there is potential there for the Conservatives to build some support, but they've obviously got a huge distance to go to get anywhere close to the Labour Party, where you're still looking at over 2/3 of BME voters voting for Labour.
But I think for us one of the key issues is actually demonstrate the reality and turn that into the perception. I mean, right now the perception with many of the BME communities is that we are not engaged and that somehow the party is still where it may have been 20, 30, 40 years ago. That has changed. I think, as you heard in the first part of this section, since 2005 David Cameron has come in, he has engaged, energised. We went from 2 to 11 members of Parliament from ethnic minority backgrounds at the last election, and of course we want to see a party and a parliamentary party which is representative of society as a whole. But what is really important for us is to be consistent in that engagement and talking about the policies that are making a difference. When it comes to small businesses, there are many people from ethnic minority communities who run small businesses. There's an awful lot we're doing in terms of bringing corporation tax rates down. People from ethnic minority communities are really interested in education for their kids. There's a lot we're doing in terms of the pupil premium to help those from disadvantaged backgrounds. There's a lot we're doing in terms of driving school standards. And those are sort of policies that we have in place which also connect with our values and those of the ethnic minority communities. And that's actually what we are now trying to do in a consistent way.
I mean, Murad, do you think this can work? I mean, Paul Goodman of the Conservative Home was writing in the Telegraph saying the Tories have already lost the next election, they can't recoup it. This might be one way they could try, but they probably won't be able to. How smug do you feel, I suppose, is the question?
Well, my experience is as an Assembly member representing various communities across London. I think we've got the biggest concentration of minority communities in the whole country here in Greater London. And it's quite clear the Tory party is still seen as a nasty party, and I think that's strongly being conveyed in the austerity package and the way it's been implemented on working families today and subsequent years already and in the future. And it has disproportionately hit many of these minority communities in a way that I don't think has really been readily accepted. So, for example, at local government, where I think much of the good work that Labour has done historically with minority community has been done, that there are major cuts which are going to cut away those line lives that many of those communities depended on to keep them going as communities. So I think what one can look at it at several levels, the national and the local, and the national messages haven't been particularly au fait with attacks on multiculturalism in the present government. We've had attacks by going back to Enoch Powell, but it goes further back. I mean, let's face it, Churchill wasn't particularly keen on the imperial subjects getting freedom after World War II, and I think the Labour Party then, under Attlee government, was offering a negotiated independence, and those kind of reflections and takes on history are still there, whether you like it or not.
Let me just bring Nigel Farage back in. Nigel, I mean, all right, so the Tory party, I mean, a lot of the commentators, Murad's just made the point, is still seen as the nasty party, but don't you have a problem that you're seen as the even nastier party? And wouldn't you have to make good on your introductory remarks on this programme and say, OK, well, there is a problem with people from the Commonwealth, as you put it, coming in. We're going to relax immigration controls for them.
Well, what we would do is we would relax the work permit scheme to allow people to come into the country who've got skills and want to work. And I think that that example of the curry chefs that are needed is a very good one. I mean, whether it's from the Commonwealth or whether it's from the EU, I think we have to accept that the census figures released the other week did shock people. I mean, the fact that nearly 5 million people have settled here over the course of the last 10 years is something that all of us have to think about very sensibly and very seriously. But, this nasty party business, I mean, we have suffered from the outset from a perception that because we're basically a party that patriotically believes in Britain, that somehow that means you're against people. We're not. And I would point out that without using positive discrimination at all, we had more BME people standing for us as candidates in the Euro elections of 2009 than any other party. So we're colourblind. But I think there's a bigger divide in politics than we're even discussing today. I don't think the divide between the Tories or the parliamentary parties from any party and the population is so much divided on lines of colour or ethnic origin. I think the problem that's happening in this country is now based on class, that there's virtually nobody, regardless of colour or ethnic background, there's virtually nobody on the front benches from either of the two or three big parties that actually comes from a working class background. And I see that as being an even bigger disconnect in British politics.
Well, Richard, well, let's pursue that, because we had probably a unique moment in television history here, where Nigel Farage is making the same point that Owen Jones was making in the first part of the programme. But class is an issue at this, isn't it?
It is. There was, I think the Conservative Party is aware of that as well. I mean, Lord Ashcroft, who is a prominent Conservative peer, and has commissioned research into this issue and published a report on it recently. He did an opinion poll with over 10,000 respondents, over 3,000 of which were from black and ethnic minority groups. And that found there was a big correlation between class voting and BME voting. However, it was stronger amongst BME communities. The biggest indicator that someone wasn't going to vote Conservative was the fact that they weren't white. So there's a massive challenge there for the Conservatives to address.
I think if we just put this in the historic context, I mean, many people who originally came to the country, to the UK, with ethnic minority backgrounds, came into unionised workforces. There was a natural affinity with Labour, and that's one of the reasons that they stuck with Labour. What you're seeing with second and third generation, as communities are becoming a lot more self-confident, a lot more prosperous, they're actually starting to question, whether their political allegiance should be the same as their parents or not. And actually, what I find when I talk to people from ethnic minority backgrounds, British people from ethnic minority backgrounds, is they're pretty disillusioned with Labour. And I think you saw that in the Bradford West by-election. There was a seat that was strong Labour seat. They should have held it. and it went in a huge way away from them. And the reason is because people from ethnic minority backgrounds feel that the Labour Party has taken them for granted for many, many years. Yes, it is the case that we haven't engaged as well as we should have done, but that is changing, and I think that is what's going to be demonstrable at future elections.
I mean, that's an interesting point, isn't it? Because, you know, if it's true, I mean, we could argue the degree to which this happens, but to a degree it happens that as communities that are originally almost exclusively working class and poor begin to socially differentiate, there's a kind of room for middle class members of those communities to change their political affiliations, which were perhaps originally Labour. Shouldn't Labour be countering that by actually re-establishing the kind of Labourism that there was in the past? Because otherwise, as Alok suggests, something to the left of you can emerge and take that vote.
We certainly cannot take it for granted. And I think it's one of those things you have to work on and not assume. And I think one of the things that I've certainly found when I've been on this programme before is the concerns I've heard from callers into the programme, and it's been foreign policy and civil liberties. And I think there is things there that we need to do to offer the electorate, particularly this part of the electorate, next time round, and make sure that they feel confident that their views and opinions on those fronts will be represented. I think, actually, many of the minority communities, like, for example, the Arab folk along the edge of the road, have got a lot to offer and given us insights in the Middle East that we don't otherwise get. Those are the kind of things I think we need to do, and I think that there is a sophisticated electorate there who would actually contribute willingly and in a way which will also help us have a better understanding of foreign affairs and where things are going. I can tell you this, they knew more about what was happening out in the Arab Spring than anyone else in London, more so than all the policy wonks that all the parties have.
Richard, let me just bring you back on this. Isn't the party that should really be thinking about this policy the Liberal Democrats? I mean, they're absolutely being hammered in the polls. If there was a group of people that they might more easily begin to relate to than the Tory party, is members of the BME communities, shouldn't they be the ones that are most thinking about this? Because let's face it, without them, the Tories look very unlikely to win the next election.
Yeah, well, the Liberal Democrats have also actually struggled to sort of engage with large numbers of ethnic minority voters. And again, at the last election, they were only sort of polling a similar percentage, around 14%, amongst those voters. So they've got a lot of work to do there. And they've also struggled to get sort of to change the image of their party, which the public face of the Liberal Democrats is still really as a white party. So there is a big challenge for the Liberal Democrats there. I think for all the parties, actually, you could be asking the question, well, how do we engage with voters? Because there's a problem at the moment with voters just being turned off from all the main parties. So there are a lot of the same issues which would perhaps re-engage voters from BME backgrounds could also just across the board.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, I think, of course, there will be specific issues that matter to individual communities here. But, of course, the reality is that actually whether you are white British or ethnic minority British, what really matters to you are the core bread and butter issues, which is, you know, the national debt that we've got to deal with, the economy, jobs, raising standards in schools, you know, making sure that the NHS maintains its at the right level of funding. And actually, when you talk to people from ethnic minority backgrounds, what they're not looking for is some sort of special treatment. What they're looking for is equality of opportunity. And what we're trying to do in government is make sure that there is that equality of opportunity, that there is a level playing field, that actually people who are from ethnic minority backgrounds, if they're disadvantaged, or whether they're white and disadvantaged, they have a level playing field and can compete.
So, I mean, aren't we really arriving at something like the conclusion that Mark Pritchard MP, who's a Tory MP, said that this is a tokenistic thing, and when we seem to have arrived at, you know, amongst all of you actually in the discussion to say, well, actually this might not be just about ethnicity, might also be importantly about class, and it might be about disconnection from the whole political process, because one of the big changes in the figures is that there's something like 15% now are intending to vote for other parties that aren't the main three.
I mean, this is actually about connecting with all communities, and I think as you saw from the election result in the US, what is important and the way that you succeed as a political party is that you communicate and you share the values of all communities, and that is certainly what the Conservative Party is trying to do. But of course, you know, there is not somehow you know, something different from saying that, and at the same time saying that as a party, you know, both in Parliament but also through our various sort of, you know, public areas of life and in the private sector, we shouldn't be representative of the society that is actually out there.
Well, I mean, I'm glad you brought up the American instance, because I think in some ways the Tory party see see themselves in the mirror when they see what's happened to the Republican Party. I mean, Obama did quite outstandingly well amongst not just the Hispanics, but Asian Americans, for example. They were 3-1 in favour of him, more so than Hispanics, and obviously the black vote, 9-1, is there with the Democrats anyway. And that's from a bit of the constituency that's going to grow in America. They're in the top echelons, top income levels, and yet they found what the Republican Party was offering repulsive. I mean, my brother lives there. I get a good idea from him living in Chicago of how they pick up messages, and I think there's a stark warning there for the Tory party. You go down the road, the Republican Party, particularly catering to a specific bit of the electorate, it will be electoral suicide for you.
Richard, do you think that the American parallel is a valid one? I mean, it's clearly part of the debates, and it's clearly part of the reaction of the Tory party. But are there enough similarities that they should really be worried about that?
Well, it's a valid parallel in the sense that both countries are seeing demographic change, although obviously the scale of the change in the US is quite different. But the other way that it's particularly valid is the way that all the political parties in this country, particularly the Conservatives, do tend to look across the Atlantic for kind of political strategy and tactics and so on. So I think that the American election may act as something of a warning for the Conservatives. As there was one of the Republican senators who said there just simply weren't enough angry white men for them to win that election, and that had become their core constituency. So for the Conservatives to fall back onto a similar constituency at the next general election would seem to me to be, well, folly.
Is that a driver in the debate?
I think what I would argue actually is the Conservative Party in the medium and long term is in a much better position than the Labour Party in this country. Going back to that simple point, is that we share the values that many people in the ethnic minorities have, and it is that shared values that I think you need to be talking about and that we are going to be articulating as we go forward. But there is, of course, a US parallel, but there's also the Canadian parallel, which is very interesting, where the Canadian Conservatives some years ago were, in a similar position to, other right-of-centre to parties. They have gone over a number of elections over a few years by following a strategy of proper engagement, but at the same time being true to their values. They've gone from, at the last election, having more people who were born outside Canada as a proportion voting for them than those born in Canada as a proportion voting for them.
Murad, what is Labour's response to this going to be? Because surely one thing that it should do is to try and re-establish a connection with those communities that it's lost, and which the Tories are obviously looking to rival them in.
Indeed, and I think there are a variety of things happening. I think I mentioned the local. I think actually the much of the work that the party has historically done has been on local level, at local government, councillors and that kind of level. And then the National has been able to build on it. But I do think if we're going to maintain those contacts, links and that those kind of votes, we have to respond to particular issues from the particular communities. I think what we've seen with our parliamentarians, they've made efforts with things like Friends for India, Friends of the Middle East and Palestine, for example, and I think they've made contributions to debates at Parliament which otherwise may not have been made, and I'm sure you'll be aware of some of that. And I think that's probably the way what's happening now, and we should continue doing that and not take it for granted, because like any voters, you can't assume they're always going to be there walking into the voter booths year in, year out, or election after election.
Richard, I mean, one of the things we touched on in the first part of the programme, but I'd like to come back to it, is in terms of reaching out to these communities who are disproportionately some of the poorest communities in the country, with the length of the austerity programme and now being pushed way in to the future, even if this strategy were wholeheartedly adopted, won't it be undermined by the austerity programme anyway?
I think the Conservative Party in particular, and also I suppose the Liberal Democrats as part of the coalition, really do have that problem of, while maybe David Cameron perhaps leading up to 2010 neutralised some of the negatives which perhaps permanently put certain voters off, to now articulate a positive and more inclusive message, a message of hope. That's just very difficult when you are in, the economy is still smaller than it was in 2008, so the government's constantly faced with very hard choices about the distribution of very limited resources. I mean, politics is always ultimately about kind of compromise and making tough decisions, and more so than ever at the moment. So the Labour Party, I think, is probably in a much stronger position to reassure those groups that it still understands their concerns, whereas when the Conservatives are doing things such as restricting the increase in the rate of tax credits and so on, which is hitting millions of sort of lower middle income families, both in and out of work. And that's something which kind of is obviously going to, if you're not already attached to that party, when you've been hit by a policy like that, it's unlikely that that's probably going to draw you towards the party.
I mean, isn't this the case that, I mean, the equal opportunities programmes and promoting BME communities as candidates and so forth, I mean, people may think that's all very well, but you can't pay the rent with it.
Well, I think the policy that we're following, as I said, is not just about individual candidates. This is about setting out our stall and explaining our policies and our values. And actually on the doorstep, what you will find is that people understand why the government is having to make some very difficult decisions. The reality is that whoever was in government would be having to make some difficult decisions. And people understand that we were left with an economic mess by Labour, with record budget deficit, and that is something that we have to deal with. And many people from ethnic minority communities that I talk to understand that. But actually one of the other big dividing lines that is emerging is about values, and whether or not as a political party you're on the side of people who work hard, who want to get on and are aspirational, which I think is the case for many from ethnic minority communities, and on the other hand, people who at the end of the day, you are not for those type of people. And I think one of the things that's going to happen tomorrow in Parliament is this vote on uprating of welfare benefits, where it is going up by 1%. And actually, many people in the private sector have had to take pay cuts over the last few years. In the public sector, they've had pay increases of only 1%. And what the Labour Party is saying, no, actually, that's, as far as we're concerned, that's not right. What we want to do is to force welfare benefit payments to be even higher. And actually, this is where it comes down to values. Whose side are you actually on? The Conservatives are on the side of people who work hard, who want to get on, who are aspirational, and that absolutely represents the vast majority of those in the ethnic minority communities.
Well, okay, I mean, that's a pitch which you're going to make, but
it is the case.
But it doesn't. Don't you wince slightly then when you hear leading members of your party making the speech about these people are going off to work in the morning and they look up at the window and the curtains are still closed, when actually many of the people in these communities are precisely behind those curtains, not because they're lazy, but because they've just lost their jobs, and they will be listening to that speech, and they'll say, okay, this man says, great, we're in touch with your values. This man says, you're a lazy shirker.
No, but I think as you will, since we have this discussion, many of these people will also be working maybe one, maybe two jobs and working incredibly hard. And they understand how tough it is when they're out there for their employers and in terms of any impact that they've had on their wages. So I think people do understand that at the end of the day, you've got to cut your cloth. And as I said, whoever was in government, I mean, let's not fool ourselves into believing that somehow if the Labour Party was in government now, we would suddenly have a splurge of spending. Because if that is what they're suggesting, then they ought to set that out very clearly now.
Well, look, you keep coming back to these values. I mean, there are collective, communal values as well, and I think those things are there within many of the minority communities that we're talking about. And to think that they just think of themselves as individual family units trying to gain and attain as much as possible is strictly not true. I mean, if you look amongst the religious communities, that's particularly the case. You go to Hindu temples, mosques, and other kind of religious venues. I think that's where you see it the most in recent time, because that's been the nature of minority politics in the UK since global events. So to take to kind of suggest that those are values that they don't give value to, I think is fundamentally misunderstanding how many of these communities do operate. And without any doubts, I mean, you may say that they feel the circumstances of working people, but they're also being hit very, very hard. There's no two ways about it.
Okay,
well, we can't get away from
sorry,
that
I'm going to have to bring it to a close there because that's all we've got time for. My thanks to all three of you and to Nigel Farage who joined us on the phone. If you'd like to follow this debate some more, please do get in touch with us on Twitter. You can find us at Islam Channel CA. That's at Islam Channel Current Affairs, at Islam Channel CA on Twitter. Till the next time, please do keep watching Politics and Media programme.